We are so lucky to have here today the people who are behind this bipartisan commission report. Senator Olympia Snowe co-chairs the Commission on Political Reform at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She began her career in government, serving in Maine's legislature. She's actually had the most remarkable experience of serving in both houses of the state legislature and both houses of Congress. And when she was elected to Congress in 1978, am I allowed to say this, at the age of 31, she was the youngest Republican woman elected ever to Congress. She's won more elections in Maine than any other person since World War II, and one of the most recognized and most respected members of the Senate during her time there. She was recognized as one of the most powerful women and one of the top 10 US senators. And I want to make a personal plug for her book, Fighting for Common Ground, How We Can Fix the Stalemate in Congress, which is filled with wonderful and constructive ideas. We're so glad to welcome you here to Harvard Law School. And I have to say, we're delighted to welcome back Jason Grumet, who is the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, because he's also a graduate of the Harvard Law School. And he formed this organization with the former US Senate Majority Leaders Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, and George Mitchell, with the commitment to develop and promote bipartisan solutions to our most difficult policy challenges in this country. And the organization has worked on a wide range of topics, including immigration reform, healthcare, housing and economic policy, energy security, and really defying the widespread belief that you can't do anything in America because we're too polarized. And so we're really glad to have you here and to honor the work that you have done following a quite distinguished career, particularly in energy and air policy work. So I'm going to ask some questions, but I really hope that others here will join in soon. Tell me, each of you, why are you so passionate about this effort of the Commission on Political Reform? Why do you believe it's so critical? Senator Snowe.
Well, I think that it's obvious by what's happened in Congress and in Washington, the overall political system today, that it's simply not working. And certainly hasn't been working for some time, and most recently, it's quite evident by the failure of Congress and the President to work together on issues that are important to this country. I mean, I was stunned to the degree to which the system had broken down. And that's what really contributed to my decision to leave the Senate, which I always say,
a big loss for all of us.
I appreciate that. But, it surprised me more than anyone because I fully intended to seek re-election. In fact, I'd worked very hard for 2 years or more, raising my money and organizationally, and then all of a sudden it occurred to me that it wasn't going to change, that the polarization was not going to diminish in the short term, and unfortunately it's become exponentially worse since I even left the Senate, which was hard to imagine because we were at that point in time. This was the end of 2012. My final date, to be exact, was on January 2nd, 2013, but my final vote was on New Year's Day morning at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that sort of illustrated how badly the process had disintegrated, that we were compelled to be there on New Year's Day morning to cast a final vote to avert another crisis that Congress had created and self-designed, which was the fiscal cliff crisis, which was all the expiration of the tax provisions. And so it culminated in that final vote. So I thought it was sort of a perfect metaphor for what was happening in Congress.
That was your final vote? Wow.
That was my final vote, I know. So we were, right there.
So Jason Grumet, tell me why you're passionate, and if you want to, you could start to also talk about how deeply divided are we?
So, we're all passionate because we care about the country and we care about particular issues. I think the passion around this particular project was really based on the desire to have a practical, actionable set of answers. Because I think in people's frustration about gridlock, they tend to wander along with notions that we should be nonpartisan or post-partisan. There's a lot of transpartisan advocacy today, which I'm still trying to figure out what the heck that actually means. And I think it is our view, we are the Bipartisan Policy Center. We believe in the constructive collision of ideas among the two-party system. And we wanted to kind of bring that realistic imagination to political reform, because the history of political reform is that it's essentially a center-left exercise. I mean, most of it comes out of the post-Watergate, Common Cause, Ralph Nader imagination of how to fix government. And when you're talking about changing the electoral system, and it appears that the changes you're making are to advantage one party or another, those efforts go no place. So our goal was to try to have an authentically bipartisan approach and to talk about achievable things. We don't call for a constitutional convention, much as I think a lot of people believe that money in politics is a real problem. We recognize there's something called the Supreme Court, and so we don't call for getting money out of politics. We avoided, I think, the heroic narratives that tend to lead to disillusionment in favor of some practical ideas. Members of Congress don't know each other anymore, which is a huge part of the reason why we can't metabolize the aggression that's necessary in any democracy. So, Olympia's most popular suggestion, let's stop governing on Wednesdays. Why not have Congress spend 5 days a week in town so they can actually deliberate and spend time? So we have a number of ideas like that. Senators Daschle and Lott developed a solution to the filibuster, which our video is for a broad audience. We did not provide the details, but the basic notion is guarantee that both sides have the ability to offer amendments. One thing most people don't know is that the majority party has stopped the minority party from offering amendments. The minority party gets angry and then filibusters. So the idea is let's make a deal. Allow both parties to have amendments and have the minority party commit not to filibuster until you have the substantive debate. Right now, a lot of the filibusters happen on the motion to proceed, which is before you even have the conversation about the substance of the bill. So there are a lot of those ideas that we think could get the system moving a little bit. And I guess the passion I would bring to it at the end is that putting deals together is really fun. I mean, it is exhilarating to get together around the table with people who have different views and actually find a common outcome. And a lot of members of Congress haven't had that experience for a while. So our sense is if you could just get the system moving a little bit again, it might start to actually roll forward.
Do you think that there is a moderate middle, either among the electorate or among those who are elected?
Not much, but I don't think that's necessary. I mean, people tend to confuse passion with rigidity. And the fact that we have a polarized country and a lot of people who are passionate around their views does not mean those people are incapable of trying to advance those views together. I think whether it's, Ted Kennedy, right? Let's talk about Ted Kennedy. Here we are in Massachusetts. Not a moderate. Ronald Reagan was no moderate, but they were both exceptional deal makers. And so I don't think there's a lot of centrism, but I don't think that means that there can't be progress.
But there are people obviously believe that, that you have to solve problems in the political process. And the question is whether or not there are, a sufficient number in the House and the Senate who are willing to cross the aisle, because Democrats and Republicans sit on, opposite sides of the aisle, whether they're willing to cross the aisle to work things out on a particular issue. I mean, Jason mentions Senator Kennedy, and I had the good fortune to working with him in the United States Senate. To give you an example, what he did was he and I co-sponsored an initiative called Genetic Non-Discrimination, which was to prohibit employers and insurance companies from, either losing your jobs or losing your insurance because you engage in genetic testing, which is so important, as we well know today, in terms of treatments. And it took us a better part of a decade to accomplish this goal, but we did. But the bill came before his committee, which he chaired at the time, which the Democrats were the majority. And traditionally, when the chairman, brings up a bill and reports it out of the committee, his name or her name goes first. But he deferred to me, and he called it the Snowe-Kennedy rather than the Kennedy-Snowe. And I wasn't even a member of the committee. That was the kind of deference that he was willing to give and to make those overtures that would almost be unheard of today. In fact, is even working with somebody across the aisle, you run the risk of being marked by the ideological, political base of your party, all those outside groups that you see ads, running perpetually now on TV, runs the risk of, getting an opponent in a primary, and where they will raise the millions of dollars against you and target you because you had the temerity to breach the political divide. I mean, that's the kind of atmosphere that exists today. Whereas when I started out in politics, and up until, in recent times, that you were able to solve problems.
Yes.
I mean, that ultimately everybody understood that, it does require a compromise to reach a consensus. And somehow there's this mistaken notion that compromise is, such a bad word in the political arena, when in fact there's nothing you can do without compromise, unless you've got, all the marbles, which in this case would be all the votes in the House, and the 60 votes in the Senate, and the presidency. Then you have to compromise. Otherwise, you can't move legislation forward, and then ultimately you can't move the country forward.
One of the reasons many people think things have become so polarized is that the primary system, and indeed the electoral process, the districting, is to blame. And your commission spent a lot of time thinking about that. Is that because that's also your diagnosis, or is that something you think that's winnable, to have redistricting and to have the one-day primary and so forth? Is it doable, or is it going to fix the problem?
Well, so it's complicated. In the broadest sense, the fact that we have a country where the politicians get to choose their voters as much as the voters get to choose their politicians is corrosive to the idea of the democracy, right? So I think there's no question that the process is manipulated. I think it's generally perceived to be unfair, and I think it discourages people from participation. It does matter. It doesn't matter quite as much as some people suggest. So a number of folks will say, all we have to do is fix redistricting. And there are a lot of different studies out there. There's a Stanford study that says they thought in 2012, 6 to 8 seats might have been influenced. There was a recent study just a couple weeks ago about North Carolina, which says it does have an impact. But I think the issue that people need to contemplate is that we've basically sorted ourselves. It's an organic infrastructure and an organic gerrymander. And my favorite political poll of all times is the Whole Foods Cracker Barrel poll. Ever heard of this? So in 2008, when Barack Obama became president, 81% of the people who voted for President Obama lived in a county with a Whole Foods. 36% of the people who voted for President Obama lived in a county with a Cracker Barrel. Fast forward 2 years, when there was a big sweep of House Republicans taking over Democratic seats, 82% of the seats that flipped were in counties with Cracker Barrels. So we have divided ourselves up such that the way we draw the lines matters, but it's not entirely consequential. I think the easiest way to think about that is there are no districts in the Senate. So the high watermark for perfect redistricting in some ways is the Senate, which historically has been a little more collaborative than the House, but it's not exactly, the kumbaya of collaboration. So it's not that it matters, but it is not the answer. It's, I think, an answer.
But I think it's part of the equation, because in the House of Representatives, when you have 435 seats, and virtually very few of them are competitive seats now because of the way these seats have been gerrymandered, that's a problem. That's why you don't have a competition of ideas, because these have become very homogenous politically. So they're either all Republican or they're all Democrat, and they've been designed that way. And some interesting architecture that's associated with some of these designs, as you probably have seen. I don't know if you've seen, there's one, I think in Illinois, that's an earmuff district. So you've got two sides and one little span here with a road that connects both sides. So, I mean, they've orchestrated all of these districts so that there's no competition of thought, because you don't have a diversity of the population. So if you could change some of those congressional seats, and by the way, with 2020, the reapportionment, you don't want to be locked into this for another decade beyond, is a time in which to identify, those states where you could get an independent redistricting commission, one that's, supported by both sides, by the Democrats and the Republicans, but it has an impartial process, and fair criteria in which to design these districts. So if you do enough of them, then you can sort of break the headlock on, the polarization in the House of Representatives. And that's the same is true with the open primaries. It contributes to broadening the participation. It's interesting because does it matter? Yeah, it does, because there's so few people voting in political primaries today. I mean, that's a problem. And so I know, just from the people I know that are in the Republican Party, for example, are they going to go to their local committee meetings or their county committee meetings? No, because it's so ideologically driven now, and so it sort of dissuades the moderates and the more centrists who be involved in party politics no longer are interested because it doesn't reflect their views. That's what's happened. So it really has turned off a broader segment, even within each party, because the lines have been drawn, in such a harsh way, politically and philosophically, to the exclusion of everybody else.
Well, and there's a kind of predictable polarization when you have relatively party homogeneous districts, so that the primaries are always people outflanking to the right or the left, whoever is there, at least to try to draw attention. And so then the people who get elected are further apart from each other than it would have been if they were elected from a more mixed district. What difference would the one-day primary do?
So, I mean, if we acknowledge that the primaries tend to elect the candidates, really, I mean, the real election is in the primary. Right now, 4 out of 5 people who are eligible to vote in primaries don't. One of the reasons is that they decide not to. An even larger reason is they don't know it's happening. In other words, the primaries, now in the presidential elections, there's quite a bit of attention around the primary day because you have 2 or 3 candidates in each party vying for the nomination. But in the off-year midterm elections, the primaries are scattered over a course of almost half a year. And we saw some polling which said that more than half the people who didn't vote actually didn't know it was occurring. And so the thought simply is that if you had a single day, or at least a few days where there was kind of regional voting, there'd be more attention. And our group, in an effort to be both heroic and pragmatic, suggested that we should try to increase the participation in primary voting from 20% to, I think, 30%, or maybe 35%.
Right. Isn't that amazing?
Which sounds pretty lame, but that would have a profound effect
25.
because it would change the character of the people participating, and I think we at least believe would have the benefit of diminishing the extremity. And then there are some other interesting ideas that are a little too early to judge. California is doing this interesting top 2 primary where it kind of removes the parties. Whoever get whatever 2 candidates get the most votes then compete in the general election. So it's almost like having 2 general elections, and so everyone has to compete for the whole populace. The imagination was that this would actually increase turnout and increase enthusiasm. The early results are that turnout decreased. The theory is, which is interesting, that if there were just 2 Democrats on the ballot or 2 Republicans on the ballot, the folks in the other party were like, if you have two Democrats running for governor, Republicans don't feel like it's such an exciting thing to show up to. So I think, but all these experiments are worthwhile. I mean, the whole way the country has achieved what it's achieved is through these kinds of state-based experiments. And so we don't have much to lose.
Yeah, the Washington Post mentioned in July that in the primary system, where these primaries span from March until September. So that's the other point, is that's why consolidating all the congressional primaries in a single day, like the presidential Super Tuesday primary, it would have a great effect in elevate, the awareness, public awareness, and the interest, and in terms of the media as well, with respect to the candidacies for so many of the congressional seats. But the Washington Post cited the fact that of 123 million people who could vote in primaries at that point in this last July, only 18 million had voted. And so in the primaries, as Jason said, playing an outsized role today in determining who ultimately is elected to the House and the Senate. So you're really having a small percentage of the population that's determining, who are the senators and members of the House of Representatives. And that's what's so disturbing and alarming about what's occurred, because so few people are participating in the primary system. That's why it's so important to focus, on that event.
So let's talk about campaign finance, which is a very related set of issues. You have several recommendations related to it, and the growing role of money in politics, the amounts of money that's involved. Do you believe that that's increased partisanship? I take it. But you also are realistic that the Supreme Court has ruled, and so what prospect is there that the recommendations that you make will make a difference in that domain?
So this was an area where there was a lot of disagreement. I think one of the reasons why we produced this video was to just give a little bit of a sense of the breadth of the people involved. There were some folks on the commission who don't believe that money in politics is a problem, and kind of take the Citizens United view that it's part of the expression of interest and speech. A lot of folks felt differently, but because we didn't think that that was really, we could have that fight, it wasn't going to take us anywhere, we really focused on the issue of disclosure. Because what has happened in recent years is that the kind of creation of these, first the 501c3s, the C4s, the super PACs, now a lot of these folks can spend money with absolutely no accountability. And there was some recent analysis of the kind of character of ads coming from the different types of organizations in the last election cycle, and I found it pretty surprising. 90% of the ads run by candidates were deemed substantive or positive. 50% of the ads run by parties were deemed substantive or positive. 10% of the ads run by the dark money. Now, if it weren't for those negative ads, maybe the party, you have to understand it's a dynamic connection. But there's no question that if you don't have to be held accountable, there were a lot of ads that ran in the last election cycle that the DNC or the RNC could have never run because they were just vicious and untrue. But if no one's taking account for them, there's no kind of feedback loop. So we are not trying to change the ability of people to make donations. We are trying to make sure that it's on a level playing field. And if the Supreme Court matures, then maybe we'll come back to that question.
There is a problem, though, turning to the people who are incumbents to make a change in a system that largely has benefited them, particularly on disclosure. And there are other avenues to have disclosure, right? The FCC could require disclosure. They have the authority.
Absolutely.
The SEC could require disclosure if it's a corporate money. So I don't know if there's any way to press for other actors, but there's a difficulty turning to the elected officials here.
Well, it's true because, no, it is true, but the pressure should be placed on elected officials to support it. And people are so turned off. It was my provision, Citizens United, that was struck down on issue advocacy. It had been before the court for one other time. It was sustained when Sandra Day O'Connor was still on the court, and then after that, obviously it lost, regrettably. We tried to draw a bright line, so that we would get into the constitutional questions, but nevertheless it didn't work. But frankly, transparency cannot be discounted in what Jason was describing in terms of these 501c4s, because really it is masquerading, those, not only who is, perpetuating these ads, who is supporting these ads, people have a right to know. And the reason why there's not disclosure, because there's not disclosure. Because people who are contributing to these organizations don't want to be revealed. And so believe me, that will have a major impact if there is disclosure. And there's going to be greater pressure on elected officials to require disclosure. And frankly, a lot of the candidates who run for office would prefer that because oftentimes, believe it or not, they may be running an ad for you, but it's not working. I mean, panic sets in when all of a sudden you find out an organization's run an ad on your behalf because they have to be independent of your campaign. And they run it with the wrong message, the wrong people on the ad. I mean, there's been abundance of problems with those types of ads. So, nevertheless, it is critically important to force disclosure of these donors because I think it'll change the dynamic in the equation of how much money is invested. You see, super PACs have to disclose according to the Supreme Court. So, in fact, the Supreme Court did say that Congress should require more disclosure. So super PACs disclose, but all they have to disclose is that Citizens for Better America contributed to the super PAC. they weren't required to disclose the donors to Citizens for Better America. That's what we want to do. And furthermore, we want to ban leadership PACs. Now, leadership PACs, you know, when they first were created, were by those who were in leadership or running for leadership. And now, everybody, virtually speaking, in the House and Senate has a leadership PAC. So that's one more level of fundraising in addition to your own political action committee. So it takes not only time away, and puts more money in the system. And I didn't have a leadership PAC. I just refused. I think I was one of the last 5 in the Senate. I might have been down to 3 out of the 100. Because, you know, I was not going to be there for, you know, perpetually raising money. And I just didn't see the sense to be having a leadership PAC. But it was requiring members to have those leadership PACs so they can contribute to other colleagues and to candidates. And in fact, in the House, you know, you had chairmen. They couldn't be chairs of committees if they didn't give X, Y, and Z. And we were expected to give X, Y, and Z if you're going to be chair, ranking members of committees. I mean, it's terrible. And so that's why this money is a real factor. There has to be change, both in terms of time, but about the money and the distortion of these campaigns and how they've really turned off the public and have corroded the confidence. And it's demonizing the other side. I mean, as Jason said, I mean, they're all attack ads. So it only enhances the negativity, and people don't forget, you know, that they've been attacked in the elections, and they go to the Senate and go to the House, and you think they forget it? Absolutely not. No, they don't forget it, and then they elevate it for the next election. It just gets worse.
Well, this dialing for dollars of the current political time, I mean, the amount of time that elected officials spend, actually, just on fundraising is staggering. And you're describing a situation in which, because of the leadership PACs, that's not simply looking for the outside constituents or donors for money, it's looking within for money. And your recommendation is to restrict the leadership PACs to the top 3, is that right?
That's
the top
correct.
3 in the leadership
Yes,
positions?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because that's become a whole nother level of fundraising and point of interest on both sides. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on members to not only raise a certain amount of dollars, but to contribute. And if you're in a chairmanship position, ranking position, even more so. But there's a tremendous amount of pressure, and that is on top of everything else you have to raise for your own re-election campaign.
Yeah.
That's a staggering amount of money.
Our sense is that people would actually be rather relieved
You got it.
if they were prevented from doing it, right? I mean, just so you all understand, a leadership PAC, you can't spend the money on yourself.
Right.
So you're basically being taxed by leadership. If you want to chair a committee, you have to show that you are giving money to, you give money to the leadership. In other words, it used to be that the leadership would raise money for everyone else. Now it's everyone else raising money essentially for leadership. And if it was not allowed, people would whine a little bit and then say, thank goodness, at least that 45 minutes a day I don't have to be telemarketing.
So I'm from Chicago, and this beats anything that we learned in Chicago politics. So I want to also plug Jason's book. Jason has a marvelous book called City of Rivals, Restoring the Glorious Mess of American Democracy. And I wonder, you tell terrific stories there of surprising bipartisan collaboration. Do some of the proposals that the commission recommends in terms of internal congressional activity, do you think that they hold promise of bringing more of those kinds of moments?
Yeah, so, you know, this is an idea that I think is hard for people to appreciate the significance of, because you think of members of Congress as somehow, you know, otherworldly beings who don't have the same emotional responses as you do. But guess what? Members of Congress make friends the same way we do. They take trips together, they go out to dinner, they spend time, you know, basically just kind of hanging around. And that just doesn't happen anymore. It's not just that members of Congress are alienated from the other party. They don't know the names of people in their own party. I think a story I didn't put in the book was we were hosting a meeting for you know, freshman members and sophomore members, folks in the first 2 terms in the House. And we had a couple of committee chairs come, and people were going around the room introducing themselves. And the committee chair said, and who are you? And it was a woman on his committee. I mean, he thought she was like some kind of, he thought it was our staff, it was a young person, he thought they were like a staffer of mine. So they don't know each other. And, you know, my broad argument is that we have been polarized and productive in the past, right? It's not just that all of a sudden, you know, politics is a rough sport. Some of you maybe have been alive during the Clinton administration. Politics of personal destruction, contract, for America, a 30-day shutdown. They impeached the guy. And within a few weeks of President Clinton being impeached, he was signing legislation, which means that while impeaching him, they were negotiating, they were working on bills. They used to be able to handle that kind of aggression and get things done. And I think a lot of us believe it's because they actually had relationships with each other. So getting Congress to spend more time in DC, requiring congressional travel as opposed to demonizing congressional travel, turning the cameras off. I mean, C-SPAN's a lovely institution, but not all the time. Take the opportunity occasionally to have discussions, as they very rarely do in the old Senate chamber. All of those kinds of changes, I think, have the possibility to not say we wish the country wasn't polarized, but to accept this is our country, how do we still get things done?
What kind of reaction are you getting to the commission's proposals?
So everyone's being lovely about it. I think the question now, obviously, is can we make that next step? This congressional rules package, which is another rarely talked about occurrence. At the beginning of every Congress gets to make its own rules. So this will happen right in mid-January. We'll do a lot to set the tone. And a lot of our recommendations are actually recommendations to Congress to change their own rules. We're going to filibuster and schedule committee activity. Senator McConnell and Speaker McCarthy have both made very strong assertions in the last couple of weeks that they would bring back some of just the basic operational traditions of the Congress, that they would allow amendments in both houses, something that hasn't happened in quite a while.
Conference committees?
Conference committees, just committees at all. I mean, and so, and our view is that when leadership says that, they actually mean it. It's just that there's very little infrastructure to help them succeed. So a lot of what we're trying to do with the commission is to provide not just that encouragement, but also the support and the kind of applause in case they pull it off. I mean, just to give you a sense of how troubling it is, Mark Begich, who is running for re-election, senator from Alaska, so he's been there for 5.5 years, has never had an amendment voted on. Not a bill passed or the poor guy has never had the ability as a U.S. senator for 5.5 years to offer a thought and have a response from the body. That's what has to start to change.
Yeah, that's just amazing, and it's stunning too, because that's precisely what has happened in the Senate, as in the House, but in the Senate where it is a deliberative body. That's what it's all about, being able to deliberate, to modify, to amend. That entire process has totally been jettisoned in the Senate, virtually speaking. That's why you have up and down votes, but you don't have the consideration of legislation through the normal legislative process. And that's why we're focusing on certain initiatives institutionally that need to change. And the key day is the opening day of the new Congress, which is the first Tuesday in January for both the House and Senate, and the new members are sworn in, at which point they adopt the rules to govern the next 2 years in their proceedings in each chamber. And so that's where we hope to include some of these changes when they adopt the rules, such as filibuster reform. For example, there's obviously a number of filibusters underway, and the record keeps being broken. But also the problem is that amendments are not allowed. So the proposal that we have is to eliminate the filibuster and a motion to proceed to bring up a bill on the floor of the Senate. Allow 2 hours for debate on that motion, but at the same time allow 10 amendments as a floor, for consideration equally divided between the majority and the minority. So that at least that begins a process, for consideration of a bill. With amendments being offered, because today that's no longer the case, as we've heard, and obviously was the case when I was there, and that also contributed to my frustration, because when I was a freshman in the House of Representatives, back when, it was amazing. I mean, I never thought of myself being in the minority in the House of Representatives, and there's 435 of us, and as a freshman, I was able to offer amendments and get voted on. And got it adopted. And it was a controversial amendment. and it was on, changing a formula for funding programs like revenue sharing. It's kind of cyclical funding in the tough economic times. But you could do that then. I mean, that's the way it worked. And the same was true in the Senate, but not currently. And that's what's going to change.
One of your suggestions is that committee chairs should solicit the views of committee members in advance of committee markup.
Didn't sound basic.
I mean, it's kind of stunning.
I know. No, I know. See, it's all changed. I mean, that's why I always said, on many occasions, threatened to go to the floor and conduct a refresher course on how a bill becomes law. Schoolhouse Rock.
Yes.
And say, okay, let's see, we draft the bill, introduce it, send it to committee, because that's where the work begins, is in the committee process. And that's where you get the rank and file, so you have their voices heard, you mark up a bill, you build support for an initiative, you hear the other side, you have actual debates, you go back and forth and get it done. Then you report the bill to the floor of the Senate, and you go through that exercise as well. That's how you ultimately reach a consensus, if presuming you want a consensus. But if you want the political position, then you're not going to go through all that. You're just going to say, it's an up or down vote, which is exactly what's happened. It's sort of like a parliamentary system now. Each side offers their position, both get voted down, and they just take it to the next election. I used to kid my leadership, and this was actually not just in the recent years, back long, I would say, how many votes do we have to have for the base? And actually, relatively speaking, we didn't have a lot considering what's happening today, because it's all about the base. And it was all about appealing to the base vote, so that you can drum up your support in your party, and so you can take it to the next election, put the other side at a disadvantage, and run ads, those 30-second ads with that particular vote, enshrined in that ad. Right. So it's all the gotcha votes. And so it's about that and not about designing the policy to go back to the basics, right, which has totally been abandoned.
And that's conference committees as well.
Oh, yeah, conference committees, they're so rare. Even in my fund, they were total rarities. And it's amazing because I used to serve on conference committees, and they were amazing. They were incredible.
Between the House and the Senate, when you have the two versions of the bill, and you want to come up with some reconciliation, and that doesn't happen anymore.
No, nothing happens anymore. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. No, nothing is happening, virtually speaking. If you just look by measurements, it's stunning. The last Congress in which I was sitting, we passed 283 bills, and it was least productive since 1947, which President Truman described as a do-nothing Congress. They adopted 906 laws. This Congress has 165 so far.
And that sounds like a lot, but there's a lot of post offices in there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of, the state flower of Arkansas.
Resolutions.
Those are not 165
right.
consequential.
Yeah. I mean, just think about it. Nothing has happened in that sense.
How much do you think that that's the goal of some people who are elected, to make sure that nothing happens?
So, it is worth acknowledging that there is a group whose actual view is that government is too big and just less stuff is better. So it's not all pure incompetence. There is some intentionality in some parts of our government. We at the Bipartisan Policy Center don't believe that that's a particularly constructive voice. I think something that we don't talk about as much is just recognizing kind of the arc of the Tea Party, which was created out of a tremendous amount of, I think, very reasonable anger and fear that grew out of this recession, and a sense that, we were bailing out big banks while people were losing their jobs. I mean, people were deeply hurt and incredibly angry and incredibly resentful of institutions, and that energy created this insurgent, very angry movement. That happens in our democracy from time to time, but they do tend to get drawn into the system. And while it's very frustrating for a lot of us who see important pieces of legislation stalled right now, I don't think in 100 years we're going to look back at 2013 as this remarkably discordant moment in American history. But these movements do tend to shut things down for a while, because they come to Washington and they play by a different set of rules. People can't believe that these 83 legislators are simply unwilling to even come to the hearings. You know, I mean, it's just there's a while in which it just doesn't register, and over time the system starts to realize that it's going to have to be able to accommodate that, and the people get kind of drawn in. It's hard to run against the system 4 cycles in a row. You know, I mean, after a while, even the people who are, you know, aggressively arguing against government have to show that they've been able to accomplish something. So, you know, our folks kind of did a head count, and I guess in 2010, when the Tea Party was most ascendant, I think the sense was there were about 90 members who actively described themselves as Tea Party candidates. Our kind of very rough read was about 30 are absolutely true, will genetically, fundamentally never shift from this worldview. For about 30, it was, you know, they were conservative legislators, had some views in common, and about 30 were just faking it, right? This was the ascendant energy in the political system. And after the shutdown and debt ceiling default, where people kind of started really getting fed up with the sense that there was a group in Congress just trying to stop things, you know, our sense is that those numbers went down to about 50, that the 30 who were faking it were conservative legislators, but they were no longer actively engaging as Tea Party. And then in the middle, about 30% had kind of stepped back. So it's going to go up and down. This is not, I'm not suggesting for a minute that the Tea Party movement is not going to be an active voice in Congress in 2, 4, and 6 years. But I don't think it's going to be 100 members. I think you're going to have the ability as a House Majority Leader on the Republican side to make decisions that don't go along with that ideology and not lose your speakership.
Well, our colleague Larry Lessig has pursued some conversations, finding actually some common ground between some Tea Party and some Occupy people. So
I think it was that common alienation. You kind of meet around the backside of the moon. So yeah, no, there is, when we finally do something to address the debt and deficit, the Tea Party will have taken some appropriate credit for having focused on that issue.
So I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then open it up. My 2 more questions are, many people are predicting that this election, coming up very, very soon, will lead to the Republican control of the Senate, Republican retain control of the Congress. What will happen to bipartisanship if that's the case? And what will happen to your proposals if that's the case?
Well, we're certainly hoping that we will see some change. Behavior, because it's clear from all of the polling and the people's frustration that has been certainly exhibited in this election. Hopefully they'll get out, everybody will get out and vote, because that's key in all of this. I know people are very frustrated by what's happened in Washington and certainly disheartened. But on the other hand, if you stand on the sidelines, you can't contribute to the change that's so essential and necessary. So the imperative is first to vote and to participate in this election, and secondly is making sure that you hold your elected officials accountable. So if the Republicans, recapture the Senate and therefore control the legislative branch of government, obviously they have a responsibility to determine how they want to move forward, where they've invested this trust and realize they don't have a mandate, because I don't think it's going to be a vindication of Republicans and excoriation of the Democrats, but rather because people had to make a choice in this election. And the choice is, frankly, as to whether or not that they're going to see some kind of change in Congress and its willingness to work with the President willing to work with Congress, because it takes both branches of government. They can't operate as parallel universes, and try to restore some confidence in the public. So will they, take those steps forward remains to be seen. Now I know that Mitch McConnell will be doing, he's up for re-election, and it looks like he's in a good situation to win re-election. And if he will be the majority leader if Republicans recapture the Senate. And he has indicated that he wants to return to a committee process. He wants the rank and file to be engaged. He wants them to work 5 days a week, including Fridays. I know, getting back to basics again. So he's indicated that he plans to make sure that members have, the opportunity not only to vote, but we're going to have to cast tough votes. Because one of the deals today, what's happened, is to avoid the tough votes. Each side tries to protect their members from voting on tough issues so that they aren't used in the next election. And that's not what it's all about. I mean, if you're going to the House and going to the Senate, you should be expected to cast a tough vote on some tough issues. And so hopefully that will happen, and that they don't overstep their bounds, because oftentimes majorities do. They interpret their majority as being somehow they have a mandate. And generally it's not a mandate. It's that people are sending a message, listen, we want change because we are dissatisfied with the way things are, are functioning. So hopefully they take that.
So, do you want to comment also on that? No. Okay. So my last question, and I hope others have questions because I could keep going on, is given all that you've studied and now spoken about the problem of polarization, why would any young person in their right mind get involved in the political process?
So, I think this is something we focus on. We did some polling. We worked with USA Today throughout the course of this project and did some polling on public service. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but we found that there was an overwhelming expression of interest by the millennial set to be engaged in public service, like 80%. And very few of those folks thought that government was, in fact,
Part of that.
public service.
Yeah.
So, there is a little bit of a challenge that if everyone is kind of loathing of government, it doesn't make for a exciting career opportunity. And so I think one of the things that we try to do with this entire process is to talk about really kind of the profound opportunities and just the incredible kind of personal feedback and exhilaration you can get from being part of that system. We make some recommendations that try to talk about some specific ways to encourage younger folks to get into electoral politics. I think we have been in a vicious cycle for a while, and this is really about a virtuous cycle. To the extent that government starts to make some progress, and I think in a moment where things are so gridlocked, a little bit of progress can actually be seen as quite heroic. The system can start to work a little bit better. I just going to end on a story which we thought was quite compelling. I mean, the last real debate that we've had in Congress of kind of real significance and substance was the Senate immigration reform debate. And it was actually a real debate. There was a markup in the Judiciary Committee, and there were amendments, and there was the kind of mood that I think Senator Snowe experienced through the bulk of her career. Some of my staff came back after one of the markup days, and they were just kind of like laughing. And I asked them what was going on, and they said that a bunch of the staff thought that was just so much fun. They had never, people had been on the Hill for 4 years. They'd never experienced that before. And they didn't know what their boss was going to do. And they were actually surprised that he or she had read their briefing memo, because there was an actual legislative moment of consequence that caused them to not just spend the evening fundraising. And so there was this sense of like ebullient, like, what a wonderful thing this democratic process can be. And so that's our hope, that it actually is incredibly rewarding when it works, yes. And it will work again.
Great.
Well, that's why I was in the legislative branch of government for 40 years. And did I intend to be in it for that long? No. But it was the ability to make a difference, the power of the office to make a difference and to do good. And that's what it was all about. And the reason why I left, and it was interesting, one student asked me at one point at one of the campuses, said, well, you're asking us to get involved and you left. And I said, well, that's a good point. But I said, I'm at a different stage of my life where I feel I can best contribute to encourage people to get involved and to reassure them that they can change this political system. And somebody told me that in the medical community said that people your age are going to be living to about 125. So how long do you want to put up with this current system?
By the way, Social Security is going to run out at about 70. So the last 50 years, you're kind of on your own.
Great. Just identify yourself.
My name is Gian Favors. I'm a 1L here. I think it's somewhat ironic that we've seen such an increase in partisanship during the administration of the man who arrived on the national stage talking about a purple America. And in that time, we've seen red or get red and blue or get bluer, more blue. I wonder if you could maybe comment a bit on the extent that you think that race has played a role in that or been exploited to encourage, I guess, additional paralysis and just polarization on either side, and as well how you think the upcoming presidential elections may be an opportunity to either see the candidates or the parties either work to mitigate or even exacerbate the lack of partisanship that we now see.
Well, I certainly didn't see evidence on the question of race in Congress in that regard. I think it was just totally a difference of philosophical and political opinion. What did surprise me is how quickly the process between the President and Congress derailed so soon in his administration. In fact, in the early weeks of his administration was the consideration of the stimulus plan.
Right.
And I know because I was one of the 3 Republicans that were working on it with the president. And I was stunned to the degree to which the whole process just really, broke down because of the philosophical divide. And there were a number of issues that were involved as to what happened. But nevertheless, truly surprising at the outset of a new administration, when both sides actually had agreed that a stimulus was necessary. The question was, the content and the size. But unfortunately, I think that it took off in the House and being drafted, and at that point, it sort of cemented, both sides politically in the House. And by the time it came to the Senate, it was almost too late. But I worked on it because I thought it was, it was important. But from that point forward, it seems, and then of course we veered into health care, and that created and enhanced a further divide, and I was involved in that issue to the point I was the party of one, as somebody described it on my side, working on the issue. But it just, everything philosophically became extremely divisive, and there was no point of repairing. So to the point of which happened today, is that even mentioning the whole notion of being bipartisan, and embracing compromise is sort of, capitulation on your principles. It's, so unfortunately you become a political target. So the question is whether or not we're going to be able to turn the corner, with those who are running for office and for the future and what they're going to embrace. But I'll tell you one thing, as citizens, you should demand accountability on the part of those who are going to be elected on Tuesday and those who are running for the presidency in 2016, and how they're going to make government work from both sides. We have to make them accountable. They have a responsibility to make their branch of government work and to work with each other, because that's the way it was designed, and that's what the American people deserve.
Hi, I'm Robin Ladd. I'm a 1L also. You managed to win every election you ran in with stances that were not a party line for the GOP. And what I would like to know from you is how would you advise those of us who don't have positions that fall across party lines to navigate the very partisan environment that we'll be going into?
Well, it's interesting, and I hope that it becomes less partisan in that regard, to respect differing views. The difference was, when I started out as a moderate Republican, the Republican Party, the party itself embraced a diversity of views. President Reagan used to speak to that question, that we should agree on the 80%, and recognize that on the 20% that we're going to tolerate the disagreement. And when somebody votes with you 80% of the time, we consider them allies, not enemies. And so that's unfortunately what's happened today. And so I think that it's going to be important as you go forward in life, and all of you, is to accept those differing opinions and viewpoints, and working with the other side, and knowing that you don't have all the great ideas. And to bring that viewpoint, whether you decide to join a political party, whether you decide to run for office, because the more you share that viewpoint, the more it's likely to influence others around you. We've got to start changing the conversation. I don't know a sphere of life where you get 100% of what you want. If you do, let me know, because I haven't discovered it yet in my life. It's a part of negotiation. And the whole notion that, this mistaken notion that you can't compromise, is, it's frankly, it's ridiculous. I love what Alan Simpson always says, if you can't learn to compromise, then you shouldn't go, without compromising your principles, then you shouldn't go to Congress and you shouldn't get married. And, and it's so true. And I think that's what it's all about for you young people, to take a different notion. Do not accept what you're witnessing today. And certainly don't take your cues from this current climate. This isn't what it's all about. And it hasn't been. That's what's so preposterous about what's transpired in the political system today. Because, as Jason mentioned, there wasn't always a golden era of bipartisanship. We had fierce debates and fight, which we loved. We loved to debate good ideas. Well, you're in law school.
That's what we do here.
Appreciate it. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. That's what you do. You like to get the best of ideas. And I tell my staff, get the best facts, see how I can, prevail. I mean, that's what I worked at, and that's what we did. But at the end of the day, we knew it was about solving problems. Now they've lost the purpose of, what public service is all about, which is about problem solving. They just take it to the next election.
If I could just observe 3 things that I've seen you do that helped you navigate. One was that you found bridging issues.
Nice.
You worked on gender issues across the parties. Another is that you're just really smart. So you'd come up with proposals that didn't clearly have a partisan dimension. They just were really smart solutions. And a third thing is that you would also, at times, be just incredibly important as the 1 or 2 or 3 people who could be could be part of a bipartisan solution. So those are 3 things that I saw you do that I thought were pretty impressive.
I appreciate that.
She's also really nice and really stubborn.
Yeah,
Like 2 other really
A great
important traits.
combination.
Well, I said I'm also a fighter. I always attribute that to my Greek ancestry on the Spartan side. I always say. So I survived.
Coming from Maine, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm a 1L as well. I was wondering if the commission or either of you can talk about the effect that the decentralized media landscape has had on increasing partisanship, or the kind of options we might have in how to deal with that constructively as part of the political system. We can't really control the media directly, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Offer a couple of thoughts. So first of all, the media has always been pretty bad, right, when it comes to this kind of stuff. I will just share with you one rather shocking story from the wonderful election of 1800, right? 2 statesmen, right? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? Statues, memorials, big shots. The newspaper supporting Jefferson said that John Adams was of a horrible hermaphroditic nature, having neither the firmness of a man nor the sensibilities of a woman. The newspaper supporting Adams responded essentially that if Jefferson were elected, freed slaves would attack your wives and daughters, and the streets would be rent with blood, right? So we have a history of this. Now, you were asking, of course, about how the technology and the filter bubbles and the Google algorithms and it certainly has had an effect. And there's no question that we don't have the kind of central voices that people accept as being kind of the basic facts of an issue. But it's also been a lot of great things. Right? I mean, the amount of access that people have to information is unlike anything ever before. The ability to find, like-minded people and create movements that can have influence. I mean, I remember when I first started in politics and government, the fax machine came around, and that was awesome because you could actually get legislation the same day it was being worked on. So it's changed. I don't think there's much value in complaining. It makes us feel better to complain about the media, but it's not a particularly actionable idea. One thing that just as individuals, I encourage my staff to do is to go on websites you don't like. You learn an incredible amount when you just understand how other people frame issues, perceive issues. We've been talking a little bit internally about trying to create some opportunities to kind of get people out of their filter bubbles. It's kind of like a poison pen pal kind of operation. And so I think as an individual, there's a real obligation to not get caught in the comfort of what Google thinks you care about. But I've never heard anybody who has an answer or how to change it societally.
I first just want to thank you both for being here. My name is Paul Suter, and I'm a 3L, and I actually grew up about 6 hours north of Boston in Aroostook County. So, Senator Snowe, up until last January, in one way or another, you've always been my representative in Congress.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why, first of all, I'm very thankful that you gave our voice, maybe our state's voice, a little more volume than our state deserves in terms of its population. But I think one of the reasons that's the case is up until very recently, at the state level, we've had very sensible politics in Maine, sending people to the national government like yourself and Senator Collins and Cohen and Mitchell and others. And I was just wondering if either of you have hopes that some of these initiatives you're proposing at the national level will help to cure issues at the state level as well.
Well, nice to meet you. Thank you,
Thank
fellow
you.
Mainer.
That's
All
right.
I would hope so. That's what we're planning. I mean, to influence, the national politics, the national elections, and that candidates embrace these views and these positions. And hopefully we're going to get more traction before that time to have the Congress, working over the next 2 years in a more productive fashion than obviously has been the case, because we're going to lose another 2 years in the life of America again, wasting time, not having accomplished anything that's so important to this country on a variety of issues. So absolutely, and we would hope so. And I think that the public, it's all of you, demanding that as well of candidates and putting the pressure, because frankly, it's going to be important for candidates to have that kind of pressure. And they need to hear your voices about what matters. And that's why, it's important to weigh in these elections, not only on Tuesday, but in the future, and also throughout the year, making them accountable during their time in office.
Thanks. I also just want to let you know that I've already mailed my ballot north.
Thank you.
And
Absolutely.
this stay in Massachusetts is very much temporary. So
We're glad to hear we need young people back in Maine.
Hi, my name is Ryan Alter. I'm a current 3L. I was just curious, people talk a lot about women being much better at compromise, especially in Congress, and with the so few women, I was curious if you ever found that was the case. It was easier for you to find common ground with fellow women senators.
Well, I did a lot of work with women across the aisle. In fact, I co-chaired the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues for almost 11 years with Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, a Democrat from Colorado. And we worked on issues important to women and families and children, and produced a number of initiatives. Because there were so few of us, we thought we couldn't afford to be partisan. And we set aside differences in our issues, work together. We're compatible, but not always agreed on all of the issues. But we had, we created the right environment in which to nurture that. And I did find that, in working with other women. They were natural allies, maybe not on all issues, but certainly they were active listeners and willing to work with you. So I did find, certainly in the House and in the Senate, we had our monthly dinners, which also built up collegiality because we got to know each other. When Jason was talking about, members of Congress not having the opportunity to become familiar with one another, it's true. You have very few opportunities. So we created that opportunity on a monthly basis, and in fact invited the women justices of the Supreme Court to several of our dinners, and they in turn invited us to the Supreme Court as well to share that. So there was that, that ability to understand one another. And yes, there is a much more willingness to produce and to be result-oriented than some of our other colleagues. I'm sure I'll go nameless.
So we're running out of time. Maybe we can take the 3 questions here. Just each of you ask your question. Make it brief if that's possible.
Sure. Hi, my name is Kira Ezekiel. I work at the law school, actually. And my question is about some of your ideas that you mentioned about campaign finance. Given what you said, just the Supreme Court has made a decision on how we spend money and how that ties to free speech and what you said, Senator Snowe, about really holding people accountable, holding representatives accountable. How do you propose we do that in the context where, in the current interpretation of the law, some people can unlimitedly make their voice heard, and some people have very, very limited means? How do we, besides, the simple answer of the vote, maybe going a little beyond that?
Well, in terms of the campaign financing itself, because some, who can create the super PACs, which is, unfortunate. I mean, they tried to correct that. And short of a constitutional change, it's hard to get at the question on the First Amendment with the court, unfortunately. I thought I had, at least accomplished that with issue advocacy, ads, and drawing that narrow line. But in terms of who was trying to influence elections, and that they should, if they do, then they should be constituted as a political action committee, not just an open-ended entity that can contribute unlimited funding for this advertising. But that's why we could talk about disclosure, just automatically on disclosure, because that will have some, force of accountability on its own.
Well, and before you get too discouraged,
Yeah.
a lot of the people with more money lose. Sure. Right? So I mean, look at, Haley Barber's a good friend and does a ton of work with us in the BPC, but Crossroads spent $300 million in the last election cycle and didn't win that many races. I mean, I think money matters, but I think we make a mistake if we assume that it's, you go knock on 100 doors and you've had more impact than giving $3,000 to a candidate. So we can't be, held hostage to that.
Great. So let's have the next two questions, just to hear the questions, and we may not even be able to answer them. So.
I was wondering, I'm Shane, I'm a 3L. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the human cost of compromise, because compromise sounds really pretty, and when we're talking in a law school classroom, it's really easy to be like, oh, well, maybe we can find some middle ground. But then I'm taking a class with Barney Frank right now, and we are talking about ENDA, and he kind of proposed the, I guess, hypothetical for us of the 2007 debate over ENDA in the House, where he cast a vote for a trans-inclusive ENDA, and kind of threw that question to us. And it was really hard for me, who kind of tends towards compromise very often, to then turn to my trans friends and say, yes, actually, I was willing to throw you under the bus, perhaps, or perhaps not, in the name of compromise, when the next year the Senate would pass a more inclusive ENDA. So just how do you balance, or did you learn anything in your 40 years in the legislature about how to balance like human cost of compromise? No,
you do. You have to. It's a tough question, but it's one. It isn't simple. Compromise isn't simple, and sometimes you come to the point where you can't accept, the final package. You reach a point, and you have to weigh that. Do you get a foot in the door? Sometimes they say, or the camel's nose under the tent. Can you start someplace in order to make a change, in hopes that you can build upon that change in the future? So does it become that bird in the hand? To use another metaphor, because it really is important. If you've taken so long to get to a point of passing legislation, then you decide, okay, is it better to get this part of it and then hope that you can build on it in the future? So it's not so much about throwing somebody under the bus or having that human cost, it's to saying, is it better to get something versus nothing? And that's always, it's always a challenge. And when you're weighing what you're discussing, so you have to weigh that out. And it's not always easy, and it's not simple. But when you look at the overall legislative process, sometimes it becomes interminable. I mean, it takes, well, as I said, on genetic non-discrimination, for example, it took us 10 years, practically speaking. So you decide, is it worth getting the door that principle, that philosophy, that right, And so it's from that standpoint you make that decision.
I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop, and maybe you can ask your question here. But would you all join me in thanking our wonderful guests? Thank you. Thank you.